what I'm going to present are the somewhat alarming results of a series of increasingly targeted entity linking tests on Nazi-looted art. And I think what I'd like to do is to start with the conclusions, which are, in a nutshell, that entity linking is not working, in particular for looted Jewish art collectors. They're frequently not identified or they're misidentified. And that as a result, knowledge is being lost as one moves to link data. This is something that can and must be fixed, but it will be only if we make the effort to identify the causes of the errors and to fix them. So what this talk really in essence is about is the risk of erasure of knowledge, in particular of marginalized communities, as we move to link data. So I'm going to start with an introduction, go over the research questions, look at 2 of the 3 rounds of tests, how we went about pinpointing errors, some of the lessons learned, and the relevance for other marginalized populations. And what I'd like to do to kind of put it in context, so one gets the stakes of what we're talking about, is I'd like to introduce Arthur Feldman. Arthur Feldman was born in Brno in 1877. He was a Jewish art collector and lawyer. And under the Nazis, his drawings, his massive collection of drawings were taken, and he was arrested by the Gestapo and tortured and died in 1941. His wife was deported to Theresienstadt and died in the Auschwitz death camp. 2 sons managed to flee Nazi Germany, and their descendants then filed legal claims to try to recover some of the artwork that had been taken. And news of these claims are covered in the press. So the artworks have popped up in major museums, including the British Museum, the Courtauld, the Royal Library of Belgium, the Moravian Gallery, Kunsthalle Bremen, Cleveland Museum of Art, Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Gallery of Prague, as well as in private collections. So why Arthur Feldman? Why talk about him? Because he's someone who's very much connected to the outside world. You could say, if you're talking in Wikipedia terms, that he's a notable person because his life and the connections in his life include all kinds of other entities which are important to link data, and their story cannot be told completely without linking to him, and his story cannot be told completely without linking to them. And you see, for example, publications like museum provenances and catalogue raisonné and books and news articles. You see institutions like the ones I just mentioned. You see people like the art collectors and other people in his life. And you see very important historical episodes and historical topics, art history, Nazism, legal history, provenance research, etc. So he's someone who's quite connected in the world. So who's responsible for ensuring that the information about Dr. Arthur Feldman is complete and correct and accessible and usable as we move to linked data? Now, anyone who's worked with linked data knows that a lot of people go into making linked data. You have your researchers, your authority file managers, VOF, the big libraries, RKD, all kinds of people, Wikimedians who decide to create or not create a record for him, museum creators, computer scientists who create algorithms and who, when they're coding, decide to plug in, for example, code that does natural language processing, DBpedia, and all kinds of suppliers of natural language processing and entity linking software. So in a sense, everyone is responsible for Arthur Feldman. And when you say everyone, that also means, of course, no one. Now, why is this important? It's important because as you move to linked data, which is machine readable structured data, if a person is not recognized and correctly matched in linked data, it is as if he or she never existed. I'm going to talk a little bit about the rounds of entity linking tests on Nazi looted art and victims of Nazi persecution. What these are 3 rounds of increasingly targeted tests to try to, after the first round, identify what in the world was going on. So the first round involves lootedart.com, which is a news aggregator that specializes in Nazi looted art. The second round involved a list on the German Wikipedia, which is 120 names of art collectors who had been looted, and which was crowdsourced by whoever was contributing to German Wikipedia. And the third, which I won't have time to go into in detail, were very specific tests to try to identify where in the knowledge chain something was missing. So it was open, refine, Wikidata linking, Ulan linking, DBpedia lookup, Google knowledge graphs, and so on. So the first round of tests looking at lootedart.com, why lootedart.com? Because these news articles are specifically about looted art and other cultural property during the Nazi period. And these are recently published articles that refer to events in the past. The deceased individuals mentioned in these articles are not entirely unknown. They appear in a variety of sources, including other news articles, books, catalogs, lawsuits, authority files, all kinds of things. The articles concern the Holocaust and so are exempt from GDPR and right to be forgotten. And this last point is most important for a lot of the dysfunctions that we saw. The articles are published in English, but they aggregate articles from other languages, especially German, French, Italian, and Spanish. So the kinds of questions we were asking were the most basic questions you can ask in entity linking tests. Was the entity recognized? Was it correctly classified? Person, organization, place, event? Was a link found? For IBM Bluemix, it links to DBpedia. For TextRaiser, it links to Wikipedia, Wikidata. Was the match correct? And if it was incorrect, which was the wrong entity that was returned? And if possible, why? So the results, first, the positive results. In the news articles, artists, media outlets, museums, and even very, very technical legal terms tended to be correctly recognized and matched. So the entity linking was working. However, art collectors and art dealers mentioned in the very same news articles tended not to be recognized or correctly matched. And in particular, persecuted Jewish art collectors like Arthur Feldman, the results were just terrible. And some were classified as places or matched to the wrong individuals, if at all. An odd note, fictional creations, that is books and films about the persecuted Jewish art collectors and actors who played them in movies, tend to be successfully matched, while the real people whose stories were being told were not. So all of this suggested more questions. Why did entity linking fail for so many persecuted Jewish collectors, even when records existed for them in Wikipedia, Wikidata, or VIAF? And why are published results for entity linking so much better than the results that we observed in these tests? So this brought us to round 2 of the entity linking tests, which was the Wikipedia list of restitution cases. So there were 120 names. They were in German, crowdsourced by German Wikimedians, so what they thought were the most notable cases. And it was the names of art collectors and dealers. And most of them had artworks that were found in major museum collections, and they were documented in books, articles, et cetera. So they were fairly notable. The results were catastrophic. 94% were not correctly linked by IBM Bluemix to DBpedia. The results that with TextRaiser to Wikidata were better, but still nowhere near what they should have been given the number of these people who are referenced in Wikidata. So what went wrong? So what I tried to do here on this table, and I'll leave it up for a little bit, was to try to classify all the different things that went wrong by, first of all, the type of defect that it was. Was it the wrong entity, failure to recognize, etc. The possible cause, where in the process was it? Was it a content problem? Was it a natural language processing problem? Was it a selection of data problem, a tech problem, or a non-tech problem, and what the solution was. So what we're looking at here is an intersection of content, process, and tech over multiple jurisdictions across multiple languages. It's a very difficult challenge. It's a supply chain challenge of the kind that industry had to solve in logistics processes. And the trick is, how do you localize the error across this vast chain with all these different people being involved and fix it? So I'm going to try to summarize here some of the biggest lessons learned in this. And the first is the English language bias. Everyone knows there's an English language bias. However, the cumulative impact of multilingual knowledge supply chains, I think, is very much underappreciated. That English language bias intervenes in every step of the process, from which entities we decide to create to how we clean the data, eliminating quite often foreign characters, for example, and to how we refilter and reselect the data at the end of the process to provide it to natural language processing programs. Knowledge is specific to a domain. So these great results we see in in named entity linking tests quite often ignore this and group together huge numbers of, for example, celebrities and artists, which are very well matched with a smaller group like this. So, for example, persecuted Jewish collectors or another marginalized community will be completely subsumed in this larger data set, and you won't see the fact that they're not being linked. Quality, this is an important point, depends on things that are often invisible to us. The date of the underlying data set used, is it old? The filters that have been applied, retroactive selections, which then eliminate information that in fact existed in linked data, but which aren't being referenced. And of course, the thing that we always know, the essential role of human domain experts. You cannot know if data is being correctly matched unless you have a human who can tell that it is actually the right entity. So the recommendations are, first of all, to open the black box, be aware of the source, the dates, the filters, everything that is conditioning the reference data that you're using for entity matching. Right now, developers simply plug in code and don't worry about what actually is being matched. And to monitor this, a data quality dashboard. So, for example, for this population, one would want to have all of the collectors and the number of collectors that have been tested, and to know which ones are being correctly matched, which ones aren't being correctly matched, so that you can monitor what is appearing and what is disappearing in the knowledge chain. To do this, you need domain-specific data test sets. That is a set of names and texts that can be easily run through all the major entity linking programs, so that you have a constant monitoring going on, kind of quality monitoring going on, to see what's being picked up and what's being missed, so that you can intervene and correct it in the appropriate place. But while we're waiting for technical fixes, projects to create the missing entities in Ulan, which had basically none of these names, or very, very few of these names, Wikidata and Wikipedia in English. So what can I say about these tests? I have to point out that the names that we were looking at here are names that are remarkably well documented in a variety of sources. So what does that say about all of the other people who are much less well documented? The problem with marginalized populations is that in linked data, it's as if they never existed. And at present, the only way to ensure that an entity will be recognized is to create it in the English language Wikipedia, even if the person never lived in an English-speaking country, and even if none of the sources are in English. It would, I think, be a pity if the semantic web, through lack of quality control and diffuse dysfunction, contributed not to greater knowledge, but to greater ignorance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurel, for another interesting talk.